Hi, everybody. Uh, Getting a little short on questions, but we'll do what we can here. This is a question from Jennifer Butler. By the way, before we start that, I hope everybody's doing all right, and especially with the stresses and pressures of COVID and your normal life. So I wish you well. And Jennifer asked, can you talk more about adverse forces and how they interfere with our spiritual growth? And if our stories or reactions get bigger, is this a sign that we need to pay even more attention? Uh, with all the changes and concerns going on in the world, are we more vulnerable than usual to interference from these external forces? This is a really difficult question, Jennifer. Um, it's too easily just mm, skimmed over, too easily skimmed over. And there's a number of dilemmas that go on. The first real one that is locked into everybody is the fact that we engage with our own vulnerabilities and our own interactions with how we see the world and our own fears and nervousness, hopes, wishes, desires. All of these things have a tremendous impact on us. We often can easily try to escape these things by making up imaginary worlds, or we can try to understand just exactly what's going on inside ourselves. Uh, the difficulty is that we have very active emotional minds, and we're set basically on an automatic defensive system, and this automatic defensive system is usually stimulated quite a bit by our emotional dispositions. Uh, we have also worlds within worlds. We have ways of seeing things, and things we know are one way when they may be slightly a different way in our lives. And so we try to defend ourselves with great respect to everybody, anybody, and our defenses are, um, let's say, surface at best. When we engage with deeper levels, they begin to deepen down. They get a little bit deeper, our defenses, and also our interactions with different frequencies or different levels of energy. Our understanding with respect to this is quite still surface uh, from my point of view. And we're dealing with beings on the astral plane as well that are fairly surface as well. They drive their or drag their way of seeing the world, the universe, into the astral states on a fairly, um, let's say, moderately emotional, moderately mental way of engaging. And they still have the way they believe things have to be by definition, uh, really as part of their reflexes. And these reflexes are to protect their views and the way they believe things have to be. A little bit difficult under those circumstances because there are all kinds of theoretical rules out there about who should be spiritual and why they should be spiritual, and what kind of person should be spiritual or not spiritual. And this is very rudimentary from my perspective, because our actual deeper perceptions are fairly limited. So we are influenced easily by planes of emotion and ideas by others in these planes, but also these planes are attached to the astral planes. Every emotion you've ever had, everything you've ever expressed is in the astral plane. Every belief that you have here, you'll maintain in the lower astral planes. And you maintain them because they validate you. Well, the same is true for those who can leave their system and be in those astral planes. So we have much to learn, and it's one of the reasons why I've been supportive of people relating in these planes to these planes the best they can, because they are really basically involved with other planes at the same time. And some don't have any awareness of that, and some do. So somehow, in the linear way of thinking, if you have a certain capacity and you take it into the astral plane, then you believe you're superior, the same as you think you're superior in these planes. That's why those higher states don't look at superiority the way we do. So it's suggestive of this, learning how to function here in a more balanced way, one would say, where you can allow yourself to learn about our vulnerabilities here and try to handle them the best that we can, and notice how we actually are inside, and not be afraid to express it to ourselves, understanding then that we are human beings on these planes and even on the astral planes. Now, that's partially true because on the higher astral planes, there's no interest in judging those in these lower states. There is interest in helping them, and helping them relates to the concept of trying to help them to get into a state where they are more able to notice what's going on internally, and at the same time not negate others and not elevate themselves. And this is like practicing for higher realms of engagement, because the vulnerability that we have is so profound that we defend against even a possible vulnerability in these states, because we don't want to be feeling terribly uncomfortable all the time. And we do forget then to try and be as understanding as we can and as happy as we can, knowing full well that from time to time we will not be happy. We'll be unhappy, because that's the nature of how we engage with these planes. Unhappiness isn't that nature. It's not what I mean. But being perceptive of these planes is what I mean. And on these planes, activity is fairly coarse. And the coarseness is the thing that holds us to these planes. And without negating the coarseness itself, because it's all a part of a continuum, as I think I mentioned before, between very coarse and very subtle, as opposed to very superior. Very subtle means hardly you can perceive tremendously a lot, but hardly judging what you're seeing, recognizing there are so many options, so much variability on these planes. And there is also movement and subtlety on these planes that we are not very conscious of. With all the changes, Jen asks, and concerns going on in the world, are we more vulnerable than usual to interference from these external planes? We're definitely more vulnerable to reactions. Our sensibility becomes a little bit touchy. So keeping in mind that we're more sensitive because we are on more alert around our relationship with even walking in these worlds, in our world, because of the fear that it presents. Whether one believes it or not, it doesn't mean it's still not there. And because of this vulnerability, this nervousness and fear, we will naturally be more vulnerable and find it difficult to engage from time to time because these fears mount up a bit. The best you can do in it is try and soften them down personally, and you can do that through energy or talking yourself down the best you possibly can. Verbally, using mantras, of course, meditating another way. But remember, as you meditate, you can become more sensitive and at the same time more protective of the nature that you employ to engage satisfactorily, reasonably so, with these planes. The thing is, one thing that's powerful, maybe helpful, is to remember that nothing is hidden from higher states, but nothing's judged from higher states. Subtlety in relationship to these planes, if you become more subtly aware of things that go on inside yourself, coming to grips with those things, it's not so simple, but you can attempt to be more gentle within yourself and more respectful of yourself. No matter what your engagement with life through life has been and is, do your very best to slow down your relationship with being imperfect. Nobody is perfect. It's the way it works. These worlds are coarser, more imperfect. And the definition of imperfect for me, of course, is the inability to perceive energy flowing through you at its subtlest level. Initially, you perceive energy flowing through you at a coarser level, and it can be quite strong because it's the nature of how you function in the world. A little bit coarser. We all do that. It's the nature of our material plane. These material planes are relatively coarse. I happen to think that they need to be understood, and science is trying to understand them. People, philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists maybe are trying to understand them. If you are living and perceive energy at least subtly, even the slightest little bit, you are engaging with subtleties different than you could before. To keep that statement in mind means you're also going to be aware of subtleties you could never be aware of before. In the construction of a personality, we often say things like, oh, I never experienced that before. And we're basically being honest, but it doesn't mean they haven't happened before. We just haven't experienced them before consciously. And that's the pathway through which spiritual growth is involved. It's involved with a commencement to perceive beyond what you could perceive before, realizing that those things may have happened before, but without your knowledge. So the question is always there. Is it good to know what's really going on, at least to some degree, when prior to that moment where subtle awareness begins, you did not know things were going on all the time? At least you can move towards having some form of willingness to allow yourself to perceive something that it's always been there. Am I saying a lot of this interaction with forces of personalized versions of how a person should be has always been there? Yeah, I'm saying that. You can listen to it on a very conscious material level. All you have to do is go and talk to people who don't necessarily agree with you. Whatever that is, I don't care what it is. You automatically will prepare yourself to protect your beliefs, and they are protecting theirs. Now, in the old traditions, the louder you shout, the more real you are, the more honest you are. It's not that way. But nonetheless, that's how we've been trained to some degree. So I hope this helps a tiny little bit, Jen. It's an important thing to realize that we are personally living on more than one plane. Your expressions are engaged with astral planes as well. Some mental planes, although most of the mental planes are really strongly attached to the emotional disposition. But there is some activity on the mental plane and on the mind plane. And the difference is another aspect, a higher aspect, or another aspect of the emotional disposition is that mental cognitive linear engagement with valuing things how they should be, could be, are according to us, for example, and our natural, normal propensity to self-protect. This very likely with us will remain that way for some time because we'll work our way through into other ways of thinking slowly, other ways of making sense of things. This impinges on the astral plane as well. You shift your dynamic here and it shifts there a little bit. But you can still be influenced by those who have different views by you from that plane. It's a terrible thing to say out loud, but knowing it's happening is different than saying it doesn't and never knowing. Well, you also have an option to do that. And this is important to realize. You have options. But the subtlety may not help you to perceive when those difficulties can occur. But the most important thing, I think, is to consider your relationship with life as positive and engaging and looking forward beyond the jealousies or petty jealousies of anyone who thinks that you're not right or wrong, good or bad, simply because you're different than they are. It's hard to overcome. We need to be not severe, but cognizant. Realize it, take it in, say, oh my God, this is me. I'm okay, but boy, this is me. I do this sometimes. And try to move forward the best you can. Be kind. Try to be respectful the best you can. I think I'll move on. I hope that's okay, Jim. There was one here that I think I touched on a little bit with Deborah Olshinsky. Not sure if I touched on all of it. I've been reading Sri Aurobindo at the end of chapter 2. There is a quote, "For truth and knowledge are an idle gleam. If knowledge brings not power to change the world." The next sentence reads, "The lost secret was not a theoretical truth. It was an actual power of spirit over matter." Now therein lies the rub. You realize that the personality is developed and caused by the use of energy or will or intensity, as Lee in a couple of talks before had inquired about. And the use of intensity can occur because there is something there within you that is able to cultivate that sense of need or intensity for the purpose of reconsidering, protecting, defending, or just doing anything or not doing anything sometimes. It's an act, it's like a kind of a paintbrush. And you use it to move that color or that energy around to suit a moment of your existence. And in Sri Aurobindo's orientation, remember, he was strictly a Hindu, even though he went to school in England and France, if I'm not mistaken, England. Apologies if I am wrong. And the dilemma with this was that in the Hindu orientation, the idea of truth was an ultimate truth, a truth that flowed. Knowledge was the existence of that truth within you flowing. It had absolutely nothing to do with the personalized views of an individual. Absolutely nothing. When they talked of knowledge, they were talking about the flow of energy operating through those zephira, those chakras. Your perception of that deep flow was knowing. It was not information that had been gleaned over the centuries. It was not the ability to assess and engage and come up with a particular definition that was absolutely, acutely perfect. It had none of that. It was not through reason. It was through deep inner perception. And in this orientation, it was the great secret. No one with it was allowed to tell others she or he had it. That's why so much mystery has been attached to an engagement with higher states. Because that particular engagement was knowing. It meant this: the individual personality would be put into a mind state where no aspects of their personality, none of their personality would be there to interfere with material coming into that individual. Someone in the old traditions might say, well, Samuel was put into a deep trance, for example, in the Old Testament, and then would speak what God wanted him to tell whoever he was talking to, David, whatever. The issue there was that the link within could not be given when that particular prophet was not out cold to the relationship that he or she, if it was a female, might have in their personality orientations. It was called a deep trance at that particular time. In the Hindu orientation, they knew that there was a state where the emotional, mental mind, lower minds, would be absolutely silent. Therefore, they internally could perceive energy flowing relative to the spirit or that higher state. So they would go into that, and boy, can this be a trap in the personality's hands. It can be so delusional, but believed to be so true. The mind would be absolutely quiet, and within the mind would be the flow of energy, or in the heart, or any chakra that higher state could use, would be the flow to enable another, to help them in a particular place for a particular purpose, elegantly laid out so that that individual could grow internally for the purpose that it was meant to be in, but moves through steps, ever so slowly or quickly, for a purpose different than alternate to the ones that they would come up with in their personality. The dilemma in all of this was, in the Hindu orientation, by the way, it's in every orientation sort of, but it's played slightly different in them because there are different ways of looking at things. But in this silent state, balanced state of engagement with higher states, the higher state was the being of expression. This is hard for us to understand, but nonetheless, when he said this lost secret was not a theoretical truth, and it was not. It was an actual power of spirit over matter, meaning spirit had silenced in a way, and the natural ingredients of the protective zone around an individual, or how they constructed a system to see things as they believed they had to be, and they can be very bright in the seeing, but this was still the matter world and not the spirit world, not coming from a higher state, one could say. Samson and Delilah orientation. I always bring this up often because I think right away of the Hindu orientation where there's Adipingala Shishimni or Shishimna, depending on who I'm talking to. And there are three pillars in a relationship with a higher state. one a willful one a more subtly receptive one, and in the middle pillar, that form that silences the individual's engagement with their personality in a moment, in a second, and has that flow operating through them for a purpose that relates directly to helping. Now, Samson gets up on these pillars, has the two pillars beside them of the temple, and he pulls the pillars down. That was, a wonderful rendering of him casting judgment on himself for having gone beyond what he believed those higher states would want him to be by using his personality's sense of need in a greater way than in those moments he used the higher state. It came out of the deeper belief systems and rules and regulations that related to what you should be if you are really truly spiritual. Higher states don't judge that stuff. But he, in his great capacity of power, if he wanted to bring down the pillars, he could bring down the pillars because it would be given that the love for his view would be given so he could eventually maybe see beyond it. Very difficult to do. None of us are able to do that well, in my opinion. Anybody. We can easily believe and see how right we are, but we have a very difficult time getting beyond that rightness if it's the treasure that we need to keep buried within us for a purpose that relates directly to maintaining the core of how we think life should be. There is no negation in that. There's process in it. There's movement in it, perhaps over lifetimes, perhaps even in a single lifetime. But Aurobindo was trying to say this, that interaction with those states has nothing to do with the personal. It utilizes the personal. The personal is filled with a vitality and elegance that relates directly to the purpose related to the higher state, not the learning and the understanding of the individual. And we continually misunderstand these things simply because we're trying to honestly make sense of them with no negation or elevation on our part. We're trying to make sense of them. And sometimes, actually, insightfully, one could say, or might say, we get a glimmer. And internally, that glimmer is a glimmer related to a link with a higher state, perhaps, or a state beyond the ones that we already have cultivated and call perfectly right. I think most thinking people realize that no matter what we come up with, and it is important to come up with things broader than we could before, so that we can move again past what we believe has to be true. And this is a link in the Hindu orientation that Sri Aurobindo was involved with. His writings on mind were, I don't know if you read them, Deborah, but are quite fascinating. And of course, as you know, if you're reading some of his works, 19th century works, wow, are difficult to understand because our language is slightly different. Mind you, most of us find each other hard to understand because our language is so frightfully different from time to time. So I hope that helps a little bit. I think I gave it a cursory look the last time I looked at it, and I thought that maybe this might be a tiny bit helpful. But remember, metaphor is a tremendous way to teach, and often many religious materials, one could say, from all over are filled with metaphor. And for the inquiring mind, recognition is like exposing a dream of a higher state. And we are trying to understand that dream in the words of our language as opposed to the words of the language that was expressed. And they're still trying to work this one out in India, and there have been many, perhaps, who have had these very silent minds. They knew exactly when they encountered another one with it. They would know exactly what was going on. They were being slowly developed into a broader link with another state. I'd like to say ultimate state, but I don't believe that that is real. I think that's a movement into a state, a higher state, where at least we might be able to go as a species. Our species, I think, is fairly young. Take a look around, listen to the news. Don't get hooked in totally with it, but you'll notice our species is fairly young. And okay, let me try something else. Good question. Good questions, both. John Murphy had a question. I slightly talked about it. How do we help another without also attempting to mold them in our image of how they should be? And also, how can we get help without insisting it be in accordance with our self-image? And dare we think this helps the world? Seems a conundrum, especially if one is really wanting to help. If you're really wanting to help, it's a real dilemma because you're caught up by the very things you're talking about, John. Everyone has vulnerability with respect to everyone else. We all have learned how to discuss things with other people and try to help them to understand how valued your view is versus somebody else's view. And this is not in any way negative at all. This is what we do. This is what we've been doing forever. And once again, some people think if you yell louder, you have a better idea, or if you talk softer, it's a better idea. It's all personality dialogue. But when we're talking, we also talk to ourselves. And in fact, the first part of the question, how do we best help another without also attempting to mold them in our image of how they should be, when we are as well in a process of growth ourselves, knowing full well that as we move forward, we broaden out our relationship with understanding ourselves, and therefore our ideas may change. You have to tell them your ideas may change. You don't want to reify your ideas. Well, maybe we do. Sometimes it might make us feel comfortable that we've figured everything out, but nobody figures everything out. Everybody is attempting to understand inside ourselves to some degree with a little honesty and as much compassion as possible. If you try to do that, you will run into the idea of attempting to do the same thing with others. You can give them an idea. Often they won't remember it anyway. You can give them another idea, which they will agree or disagree with. They will remember that one. You may give them an idea that you don't even know you gave them. That one may help them. They may even look at you and see your vulnerability as an individual being in your process of growth. And they will respect the process. You may act out as a person who is really great and wonderful and all the rest of it, because you haven't noticed inside that you're just a person. But you may do that because you're vulnerable and hurting inside and fearful, because you have an instinct inside that you can help somehow with some people, and you don't know how to bring it out. So you act in a particular way that you believe might be helpful in bringing it out. Well, and more. But it doesn't mean you need to invalidate the other person because they don't grow in the way you are telling them to grow, because in fact, they have to grow through them, meaning they have to understand what's going on inside themselves and be honest with it to themselves, not to anybody else, to themselves, so that they can begin to see that they're vulnerable, but okay. There's a dilemma with this, of course, as you know. We have a tendency that when we think we're doing something imperfect, that we chastise ourselves, because we've been trained to do that from the time of our birth. And we ultimately don't want others to chastise ourselves. So as a helper, a teacher of some kind, trying to learn how to understand that another person is growing through them in increments that relate to, or might relate to, increments that you're growing through, not only have grown through, but growing through, and try to maintain the realization that no matter what state you will be in, continual growth will go until, like the last question, your personality can calm enough so that higher states can operate through you in words not familiar, in ideas not familiar with the rightness or wrongness, good or bad, of what your personality believes has to be true to be perfectly right. Good luck with that. There's no negation in this at all, but learning about that for yourself is part of a discovery that relates to you being an explorer of you. This is not so simple, but not getting to the point where your self-identification, or ego, whatever you want to call it, gets so profoundly proud of you for doing it. If you do that, you just missed something in how you might be, or I might be, or she might be, or they might be. It goes everywhere. This is very difficult for us to understand. We are human beings. We are part of a species. The species has a tremendous amount of impact on us. And we have a tremendous amount of reflexive movement within us to engage with and act out as a member of the species. It's pretty big, but not negative. Every species would have the same thing, conscious or not. And dare we think this helps the world? Well, here's an idea for you. If you begin to see how you are inside, no blinders, and you learn how not to judge you the best you possibly can, and continue to explore and try to perceive and understand you, you will begin to understand others and the dilemmas that they have. You will see as much more difficult than you used to see, because you're seeing your own. And then, eventually, you'll begin to realize that energy itself from other states can operate through your vulnerabilities to be of help to others who have vulnerabilities that are just too difficult to deal with. Therefore, this idea that we have of us having to be perfect or talk about ourselves as perfect, because it's not real, before you can actually handle higher states, is not as real as what people would like to believe. I can certainly understand why most of us would like to believe that, because it would certainly make us feel better, but very much more vulnerable to understanding that we aren't perfect. Very, very difficult. Because judgment will come in and harass us. Because if there's one thing that we can do well, and that's judge others, because we've learned how to do that. And I know I hear voices in the background probably saying, I never judge anybody. No, you may not be aware that you do it, but you actually have done it. If you have, just realize it. Oh my God, that's part of me too. It's all right. It's okay. At least you have an idea about it. When it comes up in your real life, in your day-to-day, notice it. If you can posit it, ask for help for it. Meaning, use energy with it. Open the hands. Or both, talk to it and say, look, I want to see this a little bit more because I want to slow it down so that I'm not only enchanted by this activity. Because you can be enchanted enough that you will never allow it to soften, because if you do, some great part of you will just be erased, eradicated, and you will have to judge yourself really harshly. Not real, but it's part of how we've been trained to do things. There is such kindness, such generosity, such respect in some ways, such love, such compassion that lies within us in moments of our life, that it's wondrous. Other moments are different. All you're trying to do is allow that relationship that you have with you to be helped by you, to be helped by higher states, kindly, respectfully, bit by bit. And you'll start to notice it a little bit, and then you'll forget it. And you'll notice it again, and then you'll forget it. and notice it again, and you'll forget it again. How many times are you allowed? As many as it takes, just to soften, realize, recognize, understand, be respectful, start again. Millions of times will be okay. It's a pathway towards a higher state. It's a process. You can be respectful for being able, but dominance is a different kind of story. Being dominant about within yourself, about you, is not respectful, and you don't have to do it that way. Same is true for other people. You'll be frustrated like crazy if you really want to help people, but you really can't. Every night when you go to bed, every morning when you get up, ask for help for people who are growing. Ask for help for people who aren't quite willing to allow that to occur yet, without getting yourself in a position of one-upmanship. Just please, little by little, it will be your journey through you. Therefore, you will see their journey through them, fraught with things that they cannot allow themselves to see to. I wish you well with that, John, because you have a lot of willingness to help inside. How are you doing? I think that's it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I wish all of you really well. And remember our seminar is it a couple of weeks, Marlene? Next weekend? Next weekend. Not this weekend, but next weekend. If you wouldn't mind, these questions are very valuable in terms of trying to talk to the things that are important to you, as well as the things that might be important to myself or anybody else. Please don't hesitate to send them in, because that would really be helpful, and maybe something might be of some value, hopefully. Anyway, please take care of yourself, and we're going to meditate now. And Marlene will set it up for us.